So now I'm so happy to introduce our author and presenter today, Randy Samuelson-Brown. Randy is originally from Golden, Colorado. Her ancestors came to the state in the 1880s, 1890s, a fact of which she is very proud. She is the author of The Beaten Territory, an award-nominated historical fiction set in the vice-riddled Denver and Leadville during the 1890s. If you haven't had the chance to read that, definitely recommend it. And then her new book, which we'll be focusing on today, is called The Bad Old Days of Colorado, which tells the stories of the state's glorious and rowdy past, recounting tales of those who came west seeking fortune and opportunity and the unique contributions that they made to our state's complex culture. So Randy, thank you so much for being here with us today. And I'm going to turn it over to you.
Hey, thank you. Let me see. I want to stop this. You can see me at the height of my techno weeniness, so everybody bear with me, but here we go. As soon as it clicks over. Mike and I were speaking, oh gosh, maybe a few months ago about the nature of Colorado's women, and I was just kind of being how I am, and I'm like, I really wouldn't want to be the man who told a bunch of Colorado women that they couldn't vote. And then Mike was kind of saying, well, why? And it's like, well, if you look at some of the stories of people, especially women, who helped settle the state, it's just pretty wild. So what was interesting to see, and I'm just going to move myself right here if I can, is how women were characterized by men in prominent roles, such as the Presbyterian preacher, Reverend Thomas Bliss. He called them bawling, ranting women bristling for their rights. Reverend Matchbuff said, the class of women wanting suffrage are battalions of old maids disappointed in love. And I kind of wondered, were these religious leaders out of step with the time and the place? I think they were. But why would women take this kind of basically insults laying down? And at that point, who were the Colorado women? So here's 3 pictures. One is Augusta Taylor on the Tabor. On the left, you can everybody knows who she is. The middle person is Josephine Meeker. And the third person over on the right is a woman known as Adden Bassett, the cattle queen of Northwest Colorado. So here are some fine examples of courage, female courage. And I want to point out most of the women on this list knew how to use guns and weren't afraid to use them. So that is one good point in their favor. Ada Lamott established the first brothel, which I would argue is actually a full-blown business. Lizzie Preston, another madam, was a heroine of the anti-Chinese riot. Hersa Coberly was Silas Sewell's widow, and her family ran the Coberly Ranch Mile House, 35 miles southeast of Denver. She suffered through political retaliation and murder. Matilda Godfrey, she was the wife of Holland Godfrey, who established Godfrey's Ranch, which was also later known as Fort Wicked. Augusta Tabor, who ended up a millionairess in her own right. Arvilla and Josephine Meeker, they were abductees of the Ute Indians, and there are other accounts of women who were abducted by Indians. And the Bassett women, who were cattle ranchers and rustlers, and Elizabeth was the matriarch of that clan, and her daughters were Josie and Anne. We saw Anne's picture earlier. So timelines for Colorado. Most everybody knows a lot of this, but gold was discovered in Denver, Auraria, along the banks of the Cherry Creek in 1859. The U.S. Civil War occurred in 1861 through 1865. What is interesting is even though we were removed from the battlefields and battlegrounds, a lot of people who settled the state or the territory at that point carried a lot of their political sympathies with them. So we did have a large contingency of Southern supporters, sometimes called Copperheads, and then we had a bunch of Unionists. The Sand Creek Massacre, probably Colorado's most dreadful event, happened on November 29th, 1864. The fall of Julesburg was a retaliatory move by Cheyenne and Arapaho and Sioux. That happened on the first one on January 7th, 1865. That same grouping of warriors did a second raid in February, so Julesburg fell not once but twice. The Little Pittsburgh mine reveals massive silver lodes on May 3rd, 1878. The anti-Chinese riot happened in Denver, October 31st, 1880, and the Silver Repeal Act came through and devastated the silver industry in 1894. So these are just some background points to consider. So I'm trying to do this chronologically. So madams came early on in the early 1860s. Obviously, when we had all these gold miners out in Denver, they understood that there weren't that many women willing to make the arduous trip out here for really what was just nothing more than a camp and a bunch of dirt. But Ada Lamott is the first woman who is credited with establishing a brothel in Denver, and we had quite the red light district. So Ada Lamott's story is kind of an unusual one overall, but what the story is she was a 19-year-old wife of a minister, and her minister husband, I believe he was from Missouri, he caught the gold fever and wanted to come west and out to Denver. So she agreed to come with him. So they join a wagon train and they're going across the prairie and they come up to Colorado, and her husband goes missing. So the wagon train stops and they're looking for him, thinking he wandered off. And as they're going through the wagon train, they realize that a woman of ill virtue is also missing. So once they discovered that, they looked some more. They couldn't find the two. They assumed they ran away together, and the wagon train continued onward. So poor Ada Lamott was probably mortified, heartbroken. Everybody was probably looking at her quite heavily like, oh my gosh, I can't believe what happened to her. And she just shut herself away in the wagon, and when they rolled into Denver, she cast aside, as the story goes, the tent flaps of the covered wagon and said, this is the last you're going to see me of an honest woman. I'm going to be called Addie Lamott, and I'm going to start the first brothel. And so she did. So the story is kind of weird, because why would a 19-year-old wife of a minister, what would she know about running a brothel? But regardless, she did go forward and she did open up the first brothel. It was successful by all accounts. She became a friend of Charlie Harrison, who was a Southern sympathizer. The Union soldiers came in, the ones who went down to the battle at Raton Pass. They busted up her brothel, all this type of thing. And so it's a very hectic occurrence. What happened with Ada, though, is one of the people she knew from the wagon train actually came into the brothel, and they were talking about old times. And he told her that her husband's Bible had been found on the plains. It turned out to be the one she had given him on their wedding, and his skeleton had also been found with a bullet hole in the back of his head. So she ended up killing herself because she felt so guilty that she thought the worst of her husband. You know, the woman he went missing with could have shot him in the back of the head, but she never thought of that. Ended up basically drinking herself to death, and it's a very sad story. But Ada started a whole fledgling business in Denver, and that business is prostitution and brothels. Lizzie Preston was another early madam in Denver. She came from the East Coast. Started out thinking she had actually, well, she and her husband came out to Denver. They had an adopted baby girl. They moved to Denver. Her husband died, probably of tuberculosis. She ended up buying what she thought was a true boarding house. Female boarding in boarding houses are euphemisms for brothels. So when she realized how much money she was actually earning with this boarding house, which was a brothel, she decided to continue on with her business. She is credited with establishing the first fine parlor house where men were actually expected to mind their manners. We did have an unfortunate anti-Chinese riot in 1880. And what is interesting is this is one of Colorado's great tales of the downtrodden helping the downtrodden. So how that all sparked off is there were some Chinese men and white men playing a game of billiards. Somebody accused somebody else of cheating. one of the Chinese men, I believe, got shot, and the whole thing conflagrated because there was a lot of anti-Chinese sentiment at the time kicking around. So a lot of the Chinese residents who lived very close to the red light district ran into the brothels for assistance. Lizzie Preston opened her house, met the Americans, the white Americans presumably, hounding them into her building. She met them at the door with a gun. A lot of the brothel prostitutes were armed with champagne bottles that they were willing to like yield as clubs. And the Chinese were allowed to stay into the sitting rooms and anywhere else, like in the house, just to be safe. So they are credited with saving Chinese lives. Another thing to realize is the wages of sin filled the Denver city coffers. These prostitutes had to, and madams, they dealt with city officials. They had to pay for licenses. There were business rules that they had to follow, such as medical exams for the girls. They had to pay liquor licenses. They had to pay prostitution licenses. They had to pay off the beat cop. So there was actually a lot to it. Denver City, whenever they felt they were running low of money, would raid the brothel district, throw them all in jail. More money would come in, women would get released. But those women did fill Denver City coffers. The business of running a brothel was not easy. You had a staff of women you needed to deal with. You had a position called a professor who used to play piano and do music. You had bouncers, maybe you had barmen, but really they were running a very intricate business operation. So, and profitable. Here's a picture of the anti-Chinese riot. Just you can see the mayhem of what was going on. I think in the back you can see some of the girls in the back, and those would be your prostitutes, I think, trying to help out and throw things on the hordes down below. Next thing to talk about is mile houses. Now, mile houses are something that we see, like the 4 Mile House when we're in Glendale, or there are mile houses around, but what were they? They were actually houses away from the Denver city center, and they catered for the military and travelers along the trails, such as the Overland Trails, the Smoky Hill Trails. Mileage was designated usually from the distance from Denver. These people provided accommodation, food, repairs, and stock exchange for foot sore stock. The quality obviously varied, but this was like a whole business operation. It was like a hotel, you know, a cattle exchange, a horse exchange. You could get farrier services. They could mend wheels, all of this type of services. They were also the first source of assistance in an emergency. So what I want to talk about here is the Coberly Ranch Mile House, 35 miles southeast of Denver. Hersa Coberly probably attracted the attention of a young Silas Sewell, as he was part of the cavalry that was riding around the Denver plains trying to keep order, and, you know, just riding around as the cavalry did. An interesting thing about the Coberlys, though, and this all revolves around the Sand Creek Massacre, is her brother was actually in part of Chivington's force that did perpetrate the atrocities upon the Black Kettles Band of Cheyenne camped along there. So Hersa probably, her family was very much apparently for the extermination of the Indians, or at least packing them onto reservations. However, she was engaged to Silas Sewell, kind of the hero of the whole massacre, because he held his troops back and refused to take part in the slaughter. So she obviously was probably pressured by her family, that she went ahead and married Silas Sewell. So we look at the Sand Creek Massacre now as a travesty, but at the time, the newspapers portrayed Chivington as a glorious battle-hardened warrior who rid Colorado of a band of Indians. So public sentiment was very much in favor of the Sand Creek Massacre. So Silas Sewell, because he testified against Chivington, made a lot of enemies. It's very sad. You can hear some Mile House pictures. It's very sad, but he and Hersa had only been married for a short while, and they went to the theater one night. And here is a quote of what happened. The feeling was pretty high, and 2 or 3 attempts were made on Sewell's life previous to being successful. On the night of the 23rd of April, 1865, a drunken brawl was started at Lawrence and G Street. 4 or 5 shots were fired. Sewell and company with his bride returning from a theater heard shots and hurried toward the sound. He was met with a pistol shot that entered his cheek and ranged upward through the brain, killing him almost instantly. So Sewell's friends went to bring his assailant into custody. They did capture him, brought him back to Denver, and believe it or not, he escaped from jail, meaning he had inside help. So this is all just a tragedy, but I'm going to argue that Hearst Sewell was a person of conviction as well as her husband. And it does seem she was able to make very tough decisions and popular decisions, which in my mind would be able to qualify her for the right to vote. Next of these cast of characters, we have the story of Fort Wicked. Here's a picture of Holon and Matilda Godfrey. I got this photograph out of Nell Brown Probst's South Platte Trail, The Story of Colorado's Forgotten People. Oh, I hear the Thunderbirds now. Wow, they're really late. Anyhow, so here's a picture of them. One thing that is not often known is during the Civil War, the cavalry was short-manned, especially out in the western outposts, of which Colorado was one. Confederate prisoners of war were offered the opportunity to help man the cavalry outposts in the West or to stay in the prisons where they were kept. So a lot of Confederate soldiers took advantage of the opportunity and actually helped man the forts in Colorado. They were called galvanized Yankees. And so just so you know that. Godfrey Ranch became known as Fort Wicked. It was near present-day Marino, and the battle that the Godfrey Ranch had to survive lasted about 2 days. As a result of the Sand Creek Massacre, a band of Cheyenne, Sioux, and Arapaho decided to attack a lot of the ranches or mile houses along the South Platte. They decimated Julesburg not once but twice. And the Godfrey Ranch was one of those ranches that the Indians attacked. So the Godfrey Ranch, this battle happened January 15th, 1865. Her Matilda was never really that sure that she really wanted to live at this ranch. She actually wanted to move back home. She did have daughters with Holon, Martha, Celia, 12, and one son, Cuba. Holon Godfrey was determined to stay and run the ranch, and he convinced Matilda to stay as well. After the second fall of Julesburg, the hostilities, however, turned toward their ranch. 130 warriors attacked their business, their house. Matilda and the girls' jobs were to keep the guns loaded, firing occasionally to make it seem like there were more defenders. There were probably only about 7 people at the ranch at the time. Matilda also molded bullets in between helping distract the warriors. The warriors set fire to haystacks and to the actual prairie, so the people at Godfrey Ranch had a fire to fight as well. In Nell Probst's book, here is just a map of the Godfrey Ranch. One thing that is sad to see is it was visible and it was leveled. This whole remains were leveled back in 1973. It just kind of kills me. But anyhow, so that's what their layout looked like. The thing is, there was another raid also in 1867, and the story goes that one of those galvanized Confederate galvanized Yankees came up to Holon and asked him why it was known as Fort Wicked, and he said, well, those 130 Indians know why, meaning that they'd managed to hold off a whole lot of people with a very small force for themselves. One claim to fame, Godfrey sold something people described as needle gun whiskey which one contemporary claimed it was warranted to kill at 40 yards. So these women who helped run the mile houses had to be able to deal with men, cavalry, travelers, drovers, all sorts of people, and serve them whiskey. So they were probably pretty tough. Women of the Meeker Massacre, Josephine Meeker, we had her picture up front. Here is a picture of the devastation of the White River Agency after the Utes uprising. Nathan Cook was appointed as the Indian agent at the White River Agency on February 7th, 1878. He was accompanied by his elderly wife, Arvilla, a son who not much mention is made, a daughter, Josephine, who actually acted as a teacher and a doctor at the agency. On September 29, 1879, Meeker, along with 7 other men, were killed by Chief Douglas and his warriors. Meeker was probably killed because he was very unrelenting towards the Ute culture. He wanted to plow up their horse paddock, and that really didn't go over well. And so the Indians had kind of enough of Mr. Meeker's stringent doctrine, and they rebelled. The women were taken captive, Arvilla and Josephine Meeker and Flora Ellen Price. They were released in October after surviving about 22 or 23 days of captivity. So what happened while they were the captive of the Utes? Mrs. Arvilla Meeker was 64 years old at the time. She was grazed in her hip by a bullet and then forced to ride a long distance, after which she collapsed. The women, by their accounts, were treated badly. They were taunted and threatened with death and rape. There was one woman who, I think it was the sister of Ouray, a woman named Susan, who was a Ute Indian, who, when she learned of these women's plight, she did intercede for them and made their captivity as bearable as possible, a fact for which Mrs. Meeker was internally grateful for and spoke about it in the newspapers at the time. The women were aware during their captivity that captives were often killed as the cavalry or the soldiers neared, because they didn't want the women as witnesses or speaking of their atrocities. In a departure from tradition, these women gave lengthy newspaper accounts of their ordeal, but questions were sparked, especially regarding the attempted rape, in which Josephine claimed she decided to give herself to the man, but then scared off her assailant by courage and argument. A lot of people at the time thought she probably was raped, but she just didn't want to admit it. But I do give her a lot of credit for even bringing up the subject of rape, which certainly wasn't spoken about in those years. Augusta Tabor is a well-known Colorado person. She was married to Horace Tabor. She arrived in Colorado in 1859. When Horace went prospecting, Augusta worked. A lot of her jobs were baking and mending and performing other sundry tasks for money that the miners readily paid. She fell ill in February 1860, but Horace had heard of another prospect. Meaning a mining prospect. In her own words, the 19th of February, 1860, I was lifted from the bed of sickness to a wagon, and we started for the new mining excitement. After a prolonged tour in search of riches, the couple landed in Oral City, which would later become known as Leadville. In Leadville, she was appointed as the postmistress. She ran the Tabor store and tried to keep Horace's spending in check. As we all know, he grub-staked a couple of down-on-their luck miners who ended up striking it rich, and that pole vaulted Horace into like great riches. He fell in love with a younger woman, Elizabeth Bondule McCourt, otherwise known as Baby Doe. When Augusta was forced into the divorce so that Horace could marry Baby Doe, she didn't want it. She really did love Horace. However, when it was obvious that she wasn't going to prevail in preventing the divorce, she calmly calculated out all of Horace's assets and valued them very highly in an attempt to take him to the cleaners. She only ended up with a fraction of what she valued his mines and all his holdings worth. But here is a kind of classic karma story in a way. She ended up with about $300,000 of money in that current time. $1 is worth about $24 back then. So we all know that Baby Doe and Horace died bankrupt. It's very sad. Horace got a job as a postmaster. He was having to shovel gravel before that, and at 66, I think he died of appendicitis. And Baby Doe died penniless. But when Augusta died, she had over $100 million in her, or sorry, $1 million in her own name, which is about the equivalent of $24 million today. And here is the house that she got as part of her settlement. This is no longer standing, but it was on Broadway. So as you can see, it's quite nice and palatial. The Bassett women are some of my favorite. The Bassett survived in Brown's Hole, later known as Brown's Park, right before the Meeker Massacre. Herb Bassett, the patriarch, was an educated Northerner, and his wife was a much younger Southern belle. Brown's Park was largely settled by former Confederates or Southerners. There was bad blood between Elizabeth, his wife, and a family known as the Hoys, which is a larger cattle operation, kind of sparking off a tradition in Brown's Park of the small cattle holders versus the larger cattle operations. So in Brown's Park, it was definitely known as outlaw territory. Mavericking, denting, and running cattle off the cliffs and appropriating beefs for food was common practice. Daughter Ann Bassett took off where Elizabeth ended at her early death. Here's just an old picture of the Green River, and here are some cowboys in Brown's Park in the other photograph. Queen Anne's cattle war began when her fiance Matt Rash was killed, probably from somebody hired from one of the larger cattle operations. Anne's vendetta became focused on Ora Haley of the Two Bar Ranch. She used to run his cattle into the Green River, which you could see was quite wide. She didn't care if they drowned or ended up in Utah because she just figured those would be less head that he would have. He ended up taking her to court for appropriating or driving off his cattle. And actually Anne prevailed. Under testimony, Ora Haley was asked how many head of cattle did he think Anne had been responsible for getting rid of, and she said about 10,000. Well, he had only claimed to owning 5,000 in his tax return, and he was so embarrassed, and the county commissioners were all over that he had misfiled his taxes, that he eventually sold out and left, leaving Anne victorious. So she prevailed over a fairly major cattle baron in a court of law. And so those are my examples of why Colorado was the first territory or state really to have women voting, because if you had such formidable women who helped settle the land, who fought alongside the men, who could drive cattle, who could rope cattle, who understood cattle operations, or they could run brothels like the Madams. It's the women, we had a lot of opportunities out here that other places back east just simply didn't have. So that's why it's called Don't Tell Me I Can't Vote, Colorado's Badass Women. So thank you.
All right, folks, so now we are going to go ahead and start some questions if you have any. We at least have one, so if you have any questions about any of this woman or any of the bad old days of the West, we'll see if Randy can share with us there. I'm going to go ahead and put back our screen here.
All right. So Randy, we definitely have one question for you so far. Again, as Mike said, please feel free to continue to add more questions. Michelle asks, why did the Utes decide to release the Meeker women?
You know what, actually what is really interesting, even though the women were treated, by their own words, fairly poorly in captivity, Chief Ouray was a large proponent for peace with the white people. I think he was very smart. His wife, Chipeta, probably deserves to be in this presentation as well as a badass woman in her own right. She could speak several languages. But I believe as you, Chief Ouray was the main chief of the Utes, although there were other chiefs like Chief Douglas. I believe he really pressured them into releasing the women. But it was a normal practice, like I said, to kill the captives, unfortunately, as help came by. So I think he interceded. I know Susan interceded. So the Utes were always, they were generous to white people, unfortunately to their detriment, but that would be my explanation as to why they released them. Yeah, were there any women who came to Colorado and homesteaded on their own? You bet. There is a good book. I'm blanking on her name. It's called like A Homestead of Her Own, Marcia. And I know Marcia, dang it. They did. So women could file for 160 acres of land, the same as men could. A lot of school teachers actually homesteaded. And yeah, a lot of them did have, the book's called A Claim of Her Own. And gosh darn, I wish I knew their name. If you email me through my website, I will tell you what book it is. I do have a copy of it. It's good. Yeah, women homesteaded on their own. I have the utmost respect for them. A lot of their hovels, their houses were more like hovels dug into hillsides. There's a charming picture on the front of it. There's pictures throughout this book. And they had to prove up the land, so they had to plant trees, they had to plow, they had to build a structure, they had to keep it running for 5 years, part of the time. And so yes, there are a lot of women who actually did this. So that's an excellent question. Let's see. Yes. So Ada Lamont's brothel. I don't honestly know where it started. There was a street at one point called Ferry Street, F-E-R-R-Y. So I'm going to guess it was by the river. It might have been actually located there. There was another one owned by Mal Gallagher by that area. So I think it's probably there. But true, most of the later ones like Lizzie Preston's and the Antique Chinese Rite was definitely on the GA Holiday Market Street. It's like our one street in town that's had to have 3 names.
Randy, I noticed there was one question just before that. Are any of your books available on audio?
No, I'm sorry, they are not yet available on audio. I don't know if they ever will be. The Bad Old Days is on Kindle. The Beaten Territory is going to get re-released, so it'll be on Kindle with a different name, unfortunately, but different publishing. But yeah, no audio books, sorry.
Okay. Thank you to Jan, who says A Life of Her Own. 5 Tales of Homestead Women is that book, so we'll include those in resources for you all. Another question for you, Randy. What about the relationship between the madams and the traditional businessmen and women of the towns? Can you speak to that a little more?
Sure. So it is kind of interesting. So before the decent, and I'm quote, decent women came out west, I do believe the male business owners and the brothel women owners had a much stronger relationship. It was just, everybody was just valued. They were simply out here. In the very early days of Denver, racism was fairly rare, which is another byproduct of that. If you could make a living, if you could run a business, you were more than welcome to be out here. As some of the Eastern women moved west, I'm going to believe that women put down their heels. They didn't want their men frequenting brothels for obvious reasons. And the women, the upstanding women, are basically the ones who started with the temperance movement and the morality league, and they are the ones who started really getting the brothels to close down. The brothels were hemmed in on Market Street. It was probably partially due to the decent families moving in that gave them, relegated them to a district. And so I would say, you know, an honest wife, a school teacher, all this type of thing probably didn't have much patience for the women of the night. But in the early days, the men sure did. And I think all businesses probably helped each other. Why was it called the red light district? The story is somewhere, and I don't know where. It would be the Hell on Wheels towns when the Union Railroad, I believe, was coming through the plains. That when a man would be visiting a prostitute's tent, he would take his red railroad lamp with him and hang it outside the tent so that people would know that the woman was occupied, and I guess that's where he was if there was an accident. So that's the theory of the origin of red light district. Oh, here somebody has something. The Coberly Ranch was just north of Larkspur. Hersa later married who? Alfred Lee. Thank you. That's really good because I did want to do more research on her. So you've given me a lead. Thank you very much, Sean.
I have another question for you.
Okay.
Laura asks, Randy, what would you say are the shared characteristics among all the women? Did they develop these characteristics when they got there? Or did you think that they were inborn?
You know, that is an excellent question. I think they were not necessarily born with these characteristics. If I'm looking at Matilda Godfrey, who I believe came from like Illinois, Indiana, and there, she did want to go home. She did not like the plains. She probably didn't like the rough lifestyle. But then when push came to shove, the desire to survive attack kind of brought her into the foreground. Those people, the Godfreys actually gave up their ranch or their mile house, you know, a few years after all these tribulations, and they ended up farming outside of LaSalle, Colorado. So, so I think she acclimated. I think Augusta Tabor, who was the daughter of a stone cutter up in Maine, I get the feeling that they were well-to-do. When she married Horace Tabor, they went down to Kansas to try to homestead and found it very boring. So they came up to Colorado. So I'm willing to think Augusta had an adventurous nature. Hersa Coberly, I think, you know, she's the daughter of people who had a mile house. I think she was probably born in this area or like in the Western United States. So this is probably the life that she knew. So I think probably most of the women, they may have had a wide adventurous streak, but I think to a large extent, they were a product of the environment here.
Our next question for Nicholas asks, were the madams retaliated against for protecting the Chinese Americans during the riot?
Not that I've ever heard of. I don't believe that they were. I think I do believe after tempers cool, they burned down Chinatown. So all these people lost their livelihoods and their houses and their possessions. I really do think the Denverites felt, in the most part, very bad for what they had done. So I don't really believe there was any retaliation. A lot of the people who took place in the rioting are in fact lucky that they didn't get arrested and thrown in jail.
Great. So Cherry asks, although we will actually answer this in the information that we'll send to all of you after the lecture, but if Randy, if you have anything you want to include currently, can you suggest a good source on the importance of suffragists in Colorado? So know that we will be sending out some of those resources, and we do have a lecture coming up with our curator on exactly that subject. But if Randy, off the top of your head, you had anything you want to include for folks.
I really honestly don't. What I do kind of find is everybody who writes or is a historian of some form or another has a specialty. And so suffrage is a specialty, and I kind of deal with bad behavior. So bad behavior is my specialty. So sorry, I don't really have a good source for you.
That's all right. Just once again, you will receive some resources from the Center for Colorado Women's History. We have another question. Were there many Colorado women who filed for the 160-acre sections?
Yeah, somebody's laughing. I don't have the statistics, but yes, it was more prevalent than I thought. After reading Marcia's book, which is a different book than this other woman suggested, by the way, so I'll get Mike and Kat that information. A lot of women throughout the West did file. You know, and I'm thinking of a really tragic event that happened with Cattle Kate up in Wyoming. She was the first woman who was hung in the state of Wyoming, but she was actually a female homesteader who was on her own. So it was, you know, I'm wondering if it was like maybe 10%, maybe 5%, but yeah, they were more prevalent than I would think if you look into it, but I don't have the statistics. Do we know? So let's. Do I know about the Isabel Springer and the murder of the Brown Palace, 1912-ish? I know about it. It's another book, but I don't have any details because I haven't read the book yet. Quite the scandal. I love a scandal. Were there any women miners? Yes, there were some women miners. There is a book by Chris Enns. Most of them seem to be more like owners. So people say that Baby Doe actually went into the mines. I think she was sorting the ore that came out. So women, I think, were more in a sorting capacity as opposed to somebody who was going down there with like a pick and dynamite blasting mines. So, but you know, every time you say there weren't any, you'll find one or two that actually did it. So I think they were more owners and or sorters.
Great. For our final question, Randy, Laura asks, what's next for you?
What's next for me? I am working on finishing up another novel about the tagline is a clairvoyant, a mining swindle, and a fresh start. And I'm also going to be doing a battle days for the state of Montana. So those are the next two projects on the horizon.